This begins the part two of the audio lecture on the art of the Americas before the year 1300. Where we left off, we were looking at the city of Tikal and talking about the raised causeways which allowed people to get from one place to another during the rainy season. Now let's talk for a moment about Maya hieroglyphic writing. What was important about this, first off, is that it's very detailed and it's allowed us to have a very clear picture of the Maya culture. But also, they wrote in many different ways. This is very similar to what we see in early Chinese writing. So, for instance, if you wanted to write the word jaguar, you could use a picture of a jaguar, or you could use pictures that would symbolically represent the sounding out, the sound of language. So you could write it phonetically, or you could write it with a pictograph. I'd like you to read page 390, which gives more information about this great style of writing. Now we'll look at one more city in the Maya culture, and this is the palace at Palenque. Palenque, again, very similar to what we saw at Tikal. It was built into the mountainside on a plateau about 300 feet above the valley floor. The most important thing to remember about this, for our purposes, is this guy, Pakal the Great of Palenque. Now, Palenque was kind of a lesser city until about 431. And then along came this guy, Pakal the Great, and he actually ruled from 615 to 683. Now, when he died, they built an elaborate tomb and buried him within it. And inside of the sarcophagus, inside of the stone coffin where he was housed, was this beautiful bust. And what we want to notice here is things that show some of the convention of the Maya idea of beauty. Notice how his head is sort of a cone head. It goes up to more of a point, really, than we typically see. Well, much as they bound women's feet in early China, what they did here was they would bind the baby's head at birth, while the skull was still soft, because that pointed head was considered to be beautiful. Now he's got the strong nose, other features. Another thing about this particular bust is that he is made to be the corn god, the god of maize, who had great importance in the culture. We can also see the human being here. He is an individual as well as representing his people. Let's look at another work of art that really tells us something about the Maya society, and it's from Yaxchilan, another city. And they have a detail about it on page 394 in the textbook. Here we have the coronation of Shield Jaguar the Great and his wife, Lady Xok, who is commemorating this coronation when he is made the king by pulling a string of thorns through her tongue and allowing the blood to fall upon the earth. What's fun to notice about this, that's not so fun, but what's interesting is to notice how the sculptor seems to have taken great delight in depicting all the details of her clothing. Now, another thing that's interesting is that here along the edge we have these hieroglyphs that tell us exactly the date and the year that this took place. Typical Maya sculpture is less of a relief and not such a deep relief. Here in the writing, we have a lesser relief, and here we have the deeper relief. And what relief means is sculpture that is carved out of a flat surface. Let's talk for a moment about the ball game. So here we have the ball court from Chichen Itza, which is in the Yucatan Peninsula, and that's where the Maya people lived at the last part of their great ascension as a civilization. When you look at this computer mock-up of the ball court, my feeling is that maybe it's pretty easy to understand its significance. It looks to me a little bit like a tennis court meets a soccer field, meets a, I don't know, racquetball court. But if you look up here, right here and here, these are where there's these sort of holes that they are to send the ball through. So every city throughout many different civilizations did have a ball court. So we know this sport had great significance for the culture. Now here we have Chichen Itza up at on the Yucatan. And this was the last great holdout for the Maya people. One thing I'd like for you to notice is the difference in terrain. In the Yucatan Peninsula, it's really flat, and there's a lot more areas to spread out, as opposed to the jungles that we saw in the earlier cities. Now these are called chakmuls, these figures that we see here in the foreground. It was thought that that may have been a place to offer sacrifices. We're going to take a quick pass through Central America. In Central America, a little bit south of the Maya, the Olmec, and the people of Teotihuacan, they had a different sort of a structure in that instead of having kings that ruled over great areas, instead they had these smaller family units headed by a chief. And there apparently seems to be that they were in a pretty much of a constant state of war. What we see here is an example of their exquisite metalwork. They were fine jewelers, and this is a guy playing a drum made out of gold. It's done with this lost wax process, where the sculptor creates the work out of wax, then makes a mold, and then pours the gold into that mold. Now this was also widely used in Persia, and again I'm amazed at how human beings take on these different media across time and space. So now we're going to enter South America, specifically the area of present-day Peru and Bolivia, which would be the Andes Mountains and the Pacific coast. This area has some of the most varied climate and terrain of any in the world. On the west side, we've got the coastal plain, which is bordered by the Pacific Ocean on one side and the Andes Mountains to the east. And this plain is one of the driest regions on the earth. Occasionally, there's some rivers that pass through on their way to the sea, and these would form a sort of oasis in the desert. Also, there's the fog and the marine life that would support people who chose to live here. So, in this area, we have dramatic contrasts because there's also the Andes Mountains that soar to great heights, that are snow-packed. And on the eastern side of the Andes Mountains, they go down to the rainforest of the Amazon basin. So in this area of contrast, a rich cultural and artistic tradition developed. What we're going to look first at is this, the temple, Lenzon, at Chavin du Huantar. Now this was a traditional Andean temple in that it was built in sort of a U shape, but it was still a pyramid. Within this temple, which was located on a trade route between the ocean and the Amazon, now within this temple there was these vast maze-like chambers, and at the center is this figure. Now when you look at it, it just looks like a lot of designs at first. But as you look more closely, it's actually a sort of a fanged beast. And we're looking at one side of it. So I'll take you on a little tour around the fanged beast. Here's a hand. Let's count how many fingers. Looks like it's got, 5 or 6 fingers. Here's a little earring. Here's the fangs. Here's the eyes. It's got these crazy kind of snaky eyebrows. Snakes overhead. And this hand that you can't see is actually held up. But one of the things that's interesting about this chamber is that it had another chamber above it that would allow for someone to speak down into the room. So maybe it was an oracle. Maybe people traveled far and wide so that they could be here and ask this post a question. And perhaps a priest, carefully sitting above, listening, would say the answer into the room. There's actually a pretty good chance that's what this was all about. But really, we're only guessing because we'll never know. Now, one of the really important things about the Andean cultures was the textiles. And they did something kind of interesting in their development, in that they did develop textiles and beautiful architectural temples before the development of ceramics and before the development of agriculture. This is highly unusual. So in these textiles, they used elaborate, very high thread counts, really beautiful colors. Some of the colors were natural, some of them were dyed. And here we see a textile of a double fish pattern that is, let's see, when is it from? That's from the year 1st century of the Common Era. So that's been around quite a long time. I would like you to read more on the Aztec textiles, which is on page 397 in your textbook. Oh, geoglyphs. Now we get to what in my mind is about the most fascinating part of all of these cultures that we will study. So if you're looking at this, you see sort of an abstract design. But if you look more closely, it's a hummingbird. See, here's his long beak, here's the wings, here's the tail. The beak alone is 120 feet long. Okay, that gives you an idea. The whole thing is over 220 feet long, and it was created by digging through the top layer of dark rock to expose the white rock below. These were created between 100 and 700 of the Common Era, and there are several of these. In fact, we're still finding more of them. But they have a monkey, a spider, another bird, and they're all so huge and can only be seen from the air. There's also 12 miles of these straight parallel lines like we see here. Now, one thing that I wonder is why do that when you can only see it from the air? And really, how do they keep it so straight? Of course, you can find out that aliens did it, but I would venture to say that there was probably some other cause, but that they did have very special significance for the people, the Nazca people who made them. Now here we have another portrait vessel from the Moche people. This goes back to our very first slide of the lesson. Now the Moche people, they also lived in Peru, and they were known for their ceramics, including these sort of vessels that were portraits that allow us to see what the people might have actually looked like. When you think of ceramics, you have to also think of the firing process and the glaze process. And this particular example shows the sophistication of the people who created it. Our last bit of art as we tour around the Americas, that's from South America, our last slide, is this ear spool. And I'm going to show it here because it shows the great artistry of the people who created it. Again, it's from the Moche people of Peru. But one thing I think that's kind of just great is that it's an ear spool, and these are all warriors. And look, they have ear spools on. So they're wearing, it's showing the people wearing the jewelry that the jewelry is. It also brings us back to the fact that these were very warlike cultures who did tend to, shall we say, fight amongst themselves quite a bit. It was an important part of their lives. It also brings to mind that they were incredible artisans and craftspeople, and we still know so much about the cultures because of these beautiful artifacts that they left behind. Speaking of beautiful artifacts, let's jump up to North America now. Here is an effigy pipe from the Hopewell people. During the time that we've been looking at in South America, North America was much more sparsely populated. There were less people living up here. Well, we do know that there were people in Florida, in the eastern woodlands, and in the American Southwest. It was not nearly as populated, and the cities were not as large. What we have here is from the Hopewell people who lived in the Mississippi region. Now, what's fascinating about the Hopewell is that their trade goods come from as far north as the Upper Peninsula, from modern-day Wyoming, from Florida, and from up in the Northeast. So we know that they did quite a bit of trading. Also, the Hopewell were very sophisticated artisans, as we can see in this beaver pipe with pearl eyes. Let's take a look at more of the mound culture. Throughout the Americas, there was this drive to create earthworks, earth mounds, and this is the Great Serpent Mound in Ohio. Now, this was built in the first millennia, and then it was abandoned and discovered by explorers in the 1700s. Now, it's interesting to consider what happened when the Europeans came to North America and to South and Central America. They brought firearms, they brought horses, and they brought disease. And that disease killed up to 70% of the native people because there was no defenses against diseases such as smallpox. If you can imagine what would happen to a society when up to 70% of the people were killed, that's really what happened to these societies. And so many of their ceremonial centers were just abandoned as they struggled to simply survive. If you look here, you can see these little stairs right here. And that will give you an idea of size of this incredible earthworks. Let's go now to East St. Louis, the city of Cahokia. Here we have the Missouri, the Illinois, and the Mississippi River all converging in a place where we have the present-day city of St. Louis. Now, the city of Cahokia probably goes back to maybe as early as 3000 BC. I'll tell you that the earliest site that is really worked with here in North America is Poverty Point in Louisiana. That goes back as far as 5000 BC. But let's look at Cahokia as it was in its heyday, shall we say. First, there was this great mound. Again, they're mounding up earth. And this thing was huge, 15 acres, and going as high as 100 feet. On top, it had this little round structure. So again, that was probably a ceremonial center, maybe where the priests did whatever they did. But around this one big mound are as many as 100 mounds inside that stockade. The population here was up to 10,000 inside and 15,000 in the greater area. These early inhabitants obviously had a lot of observation of the sun, of the solstices, of the season, because this structure here is aligned to the solstice, as is this circle of posts here. It's a henge, much as Stonehenge. On the summer solstice and the winter solstice, these posts will line up so that the shadows align perfectly. Now, this could help a society to keep track of the seasons. Let's take a brief jaunt into the Everglades. Here is a wooden piece from the glade culture that was buried in the mud and uncovered. Most of the relics from the early glade people have really been destroyed because they're wood and they've simply rotted. When they pulled this bird out, there was these beautiful wings that came with it, but as soon as they dried, they just turned to dust. So we can only imagine what this would be. Maybe a throne piece, maybe part of a home, but they did have a really sophisticated eye for sculpture. So let's venture now to the southwest of North America. Here we have a bowl with scorpions. The American Southwest was home to three major cultures in the early part of the Americas that we're looking at today. First, we have the Hohokam, and they were in central and southern Arizona. Now, they had very sophisticated irrigation systems, and they also had the ball court, which tells us that they had some kind of a connection with Mexico and Central America. Another thing they had was these multi-story residences where they would all live together. Another of the cultures of the American Southwest was the Mimbre Mogollon culture. And this culture lived in the mountains of New Mexico, and they produced these elaborate ceramics. This is pretty typical of the fanciful animals and sometimes stylized people that would appear in their pottery. And if you think about the fact that this was made around the year 1000, it's really a sophisticated work of art of the bowl with scorpions. One thing that's interesting about these bowls is that most of them are found buried beneath the floor of a house, with a hole punctured in them, turned upside down. So perhaps the thought is that they believe that these bowls with holes would allow in the spirit and let the person ascend to heaven after they died. The third culture is one that's really commonly known as Anasazi culture. It's also known as the Pueblo culture. In our book they call it the Puebloians. It's easier to say Pueblo culture from where I sit. But much as the Membre culture, these folks really had a sophisticated level of pottery. These peoples, the Membre Magian culture, they lived around the Four Corners area, where Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona meet. And they are one of the few Native Americans that were able to stay in this place after resettlement in the 1800s. Now, this particular jar is a seed jar, and I love it because on one hand, it's really beautiful, and it's also very practical. It has holes in the top, so you would hang this jar from the ceiling so that you could put your seeds in it and the little mice would not be able to get to it. Let's look a little bit more at some sites from the Pueblo people. This is Pueblo Bonito. Here we have Pueblo Bonito that's at the center of Chaco Canyon. Chaco Canyon was a major Anasazi or a Pueblo site. It's in present-day New Mexico. There was 9 great pueblos that were built in this area, and this is the largest. One interesting fact about this pueblo is that radiating out from this site are many long, straight roads. And by straight, I mean really straight. They were undeterred by cliffs or whatever they had to go through. If it was a cliff, there were stairs carved, and there were these wide, probably processional roads that touched over 70 other communities. Now this leads us to believe that Pueblo Bonito was a center and that these were processional ways. If you look at this pueblo, at what remains of it, you can imagine that at its height, which was around the year 1200, there were over 800 rooms here. And when you see those circles near the what we see here are kivas, and that was places for worship. At the center of each kiva was something that they called the navel of the earth, which would connect them to the center of the earth, an important part of their religion. Let's talk a little bit about painting on the rocks, which will wind up our slide lecture. Here we have what they call a pictograph, and a pictograph means that the artist is painting upon the stone. And this is one of those mysterious images of shrouded figures that have probably had some kind of spiritual significance, which we can really only guess at. Now we have petroglyphs, and with petroglyphs they scrape away a substance that's called desert varnish. As you can see, the brown surface of the stone had revealed beneath that the white, bright stone which tells the stories in pictures. Our final slide will take us back to 1873 in Canyon de Chelly. And here we see a pueblo and its ancient ruins, but it really helps to get the scale and the scope of how these peoples lived. We can really only imagine what their lives were like as they lived safely in the recesses of the cliff. But it must have been a life rich in culture and ceremony, as we can see by all of the beautiful artifacts that they left behind. So this concludes the lecture, and thanks for listening.